So once again, good morning, everyone. I'm Shada Islam. I work at a think tank based in Brussels called Friends of Europe. And we have a very active and successful Africa program, and we're working very closely with the European institutions and with Arantxa Gonzalez of the ITC to try and revitalize the Europe-Africa relationship. So you can imagine how honored I am to be here at the headquarters of the African Union. Actually, I'm thrilled to be here, and I've been taking pictures of myself and tweeting about my presence here. I'm that delighted. As I said, as the moderator said before, I really want this to be an interactive session. We're talking about investing in one Africa. And based in Brussels, as I am, the African Continental Free Trade Area has really created a buzz around the world, a buzz in Europe, but in other parts of the world as well. We know that this is going to be a game changer for Africa and for Africans, but also really a game changer for how people across the world view Africa and view Africans. We are all over the world looking at this One Africa initiative, the potentials, the possibilities, but also the challenges that lie ahead. Now, of course, we know that AfCFTA, and I asked yesterday a colleague, how do you actually say African Continental Free Trade Area, AfCFTA? And he said, no, it's AfCFTA. So I'm going to call it AfCFTA. So AfCFTA is about not just creating an African single market of 1.2 billion people, but it's much, much more. It's actually about, and Arantxa said it, and I think you've heard it now for 2 days already, it's about the structural transformation of Africa. And that's what's really exciting. It's about intra-African trade, promoting growth, deeper economic integration. It's about more investments, African investments, African business, but also foreign investments. And it's fast-tracking Africa into Agenda 2030, aligning African policies with Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals. So we know also, and I think your presence here is proof of this, that African firms are going to be the key to the economic transformation, but governments will have to make sure that the right policies are in place to ensure that transformation. So in this panel, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to try and get different points of view on what AfCFTA means for them, for the business community, for the European Union, and also for the Islamic development organizations. So let's start off about this. Let me introduce the panelists a little bit more in detail than I did before. So to my left, we have Ms. Khumbudzo Ntshavheni. She's the Minister for Small Business Development in South Africa. And Minister, we're really happy to have you here, because when we talk about these huge free trade areas, and we talk about economic growth and investments, we often talk about the big companies, the big multinationals, the big African companies that are going to be working here. But it's also about small and medium-sized enterprises. And so my question to you to kick off would be really, how are you going to ensure, what are your hopes for a more inclusive development of Africa, and also to get to the base of the pyramid, as it were, to get everyone involved? Please.
Thank you. For us, and our approach is that the African Continental Free Trade Area is not about big business, it's about SMMEs in our continent, because it's going to create the 8th largest market in the world. And for that 8th largest market, what is the character of that market? Is a market that is not industrialized, or it's at early stages of industrialization, but it's also a market where the intra-regional trade is very low. Mm-hmm. That there may be weaknesses, but those are strengths. So the approach we've taken in our country is that even when you are sourcing investment into South Africa, we have set goals of saying what is the level of participation for SMMEs. 2 days ago, there was a discussion in this forum about the automotive sector. South Africa is the largest has the largest automotive industry in the continent. And our argument is that you can't talk about Africa being the recipients of cars manufactured anywhere else or assembled in Africa and nothing else without the participations of Africans. So what we have done is that we've started to then demand local content issues. And the local content issues, we say, in the local content, you need the SMMEs to be suppliers of components. For instance, at tier 3, tier 2, and the entry level is tier 4. So we're supplying components with a view that at some point there should be a car for Africa because our environment are different. In that space, where the labeling and the source of origin that comes into play with the African market, will say, when I say the car is made in Africa, because it's made in South Africa, it will have 70% of its component, or 50%, or 30, whatever percentage you will agree on, that comes from an African country. So that, and the SMMEs are benefiting, because that's where we're playing, as they enhance the skills. We have even put a condition that you can't put an SMME at tier 4 perpetually, they must graduate. We must see a graduation to tier 2, to tier 3, to tier 2, to tier 1, until they can eventually be able to do their own car. That's the conversation we're having. Similarly, we're having a conversation around how do we increase the trade between our countries. We're sitting here in Ethiopia, and greetings to the Minister for Trade and Industry of Ethiopia, is the hub of the best coffee in the African continent. In South Africa, we are the largest consumers of coffee in the continent. But interestingly, we drink very expensive but poor coffee from somewhere else I will not mention brands. But imagine if we could get the Ethiopian companies to export the coffee, not only as coffee beans, but also a fully processed coffee. Sometimes we'll need the coffee beans. South Africa, in terms of herbal teas, we're the first to come with a herbal tea in terms of rooibos. And by the way, we must announce that we got our communities that they were first originators of rooibos to have shares and get royalties from rooibos. But all over the world and all over Africa, people are talking about drinking healthy tea, herbal teas. But where's the rooibos? I had to travel with my own package of rooibos to come here because I can't do without rooibos. I still drink the coffee, but I prefer the rooibos. So to wake me up, I do the coffee, but to keep me calm, I do the rooibos. So for us, the fact that the market is at early stages of industrialization, it means there are opportunities for Africans to say, what are the niche areas? What are the areas of strength? How do we collaborate? When South Africa is trading this, what are we taking in back home? And it will not continue, the market will not work if there's not a balance of the intra-trade relations. So we must say, what is stronger in Ethiopia for it to go to South Africa? For instance, we are now back onto the African fashion. But in Southern Africa, we are not very strong on fabrics. But in West and East Africa, they're very strong in fabrics, and the fabrics are beautiful. But why are we not getting our fabrics here and we make our fashion all over and make it nice? And we've started to do that. So those are the small things that we do. 2 weeks ago, I was in a panel in our own investment conference with the startups, SMME and startups for innovation. We put in a panel because we've got an electricity problem. You know, it's known worldwide. It's not an electricity problem, it's our electricity utility problem. So we said, how do we prepare for an alternative platform and also to make it green, because we're all going green. Young people decided they're not going to do financial things, tax things. They're going to, on their tech startups, they're going to look at how do they use solar and do mini grid, solar grid powers. They do not have an independent power producer license. You know, South Africa, we regulate everything. We don't want disorder. We regulate everything. So the young people said, you won't give us the licenses. You know what they did? They simply went and developed a monetized system to do the grid. So they've put in Eastern Cape a mini grid that has powered 90 households. Those households were ordinarily not going to be affording the electricity from Eskom because it's expensive, but now they can recover the money. And we said to them in the discussion, they say, no, but the African market, in Africa, there's poor penetration of electrification. And we said, Eskom has been at the back of more power generation, electricity supply into the sub-Saharan Southern Africa in particular. How do you use the opportunity to make sure that the power can go with your own models? And that's the discussion to say, can't we get those technologies, those young people, to export that technology across, and what do we get in return? What do we source from the rest of the continent in return? So for us, the opportunities of the fact that we have been low on inter-regional trade, it improves the opportunities for businesses to start to interact directly. But secondly, the fact that we are not fully industrialized, it's an opportunity for business to help us industrialize. And that must be led by our own SMMEs. Thank you.
So, Minister, thank you. So a lot of creativity, a lot of innovative talent, a lot of energy out there that needs to be unleashed. And what you're saying to me is the AfCFTA, if I may call it that, is going to try and unlock all this potential that's been held back. I just wanted to ask you as a quick follow-up, how exactly are you going to do that? Is it going to be all within the territory and the competencies of the African Union? What are your, we call them in Europe, member states? What are the countries of Africa going to do together within the AU to try and make this come through? For instance, you as a minister, are you going to be talking to your neighboring countries and say, hi guys, we've got this fashion idea, you've got the fabric, we've got the ideas. Are you going to do it in that way, or are you going to wait for the things to come from above and then work?
It will never work if it comes from above. I think the European Union challenges which has led to the Brexit shows you that it will never work if it's from above. It must be initiated between member
Thank
states.
you for mentioning Brexit very early on. That's very kind.
My apologies. My apologies. The member states must derive it because it must be seen as organic. It can't be imposed. Because, for instance, we had a discussion when Burberry, the fashion house, took advantage of the Basotho blanket and the Sisheshe cloth and did their own fashion. And we felt that the government of Lesotho won't lead, but we've got part of Basothos who are South Africans. So we took the fight to Burberry and said, we need to defend that. But that's the search that the member states must do. And we had a conversation with the government of Lesotho and say, you will not take up this fight. What we need is for you to support so that, because you hold majority of the Basotho, so we're going to then take up the fight on behalf of all of us because it has a regional interest. We are working next year, we are with the SACU plus M. We are working on what are the immediate things we can do to encourage intra-trade between our countries. Already through the SACU protocols, we already do a lot of exchanges, a lot of remittances across, and we're saying we have an easy platform to start in terms of working together and driving the integration, because if it's not organic, it's not going to work. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. So I'd like to say that the Minister has spoken. I'd love you to come up with some questions for her about the practicalities and actually how this is going to work. So please put your thinking caps on, get some questions ready for when we go to the question and answer session. Thank you very much, Minister. Some very great ideas there to follow up. Ashish Thakkar, so let me introduce you properly. You're the Chief Executive Officer of Mara Phones, very well-known brand across Africa, but also, I have to say, increasingly outside Africa. And of course, Mara Corporation has a presence, I think you said, 26 countries in Africa, and you're at the head of a spearheading, if I may say so, a great new project where you're actually manufacturing phones in Africa. That's the first time it's being done in Africa. So I wanted to ask you, Ashish, from your point of view, this must be kind of like a dream come true. Now, you know, instead of working in one country, maybe 2, 3, 26 countries, you're going to have 54 countries. And the sky's the limit, right?
Thank you very much, Shada. And ministers, Your Excellency Gonzalez as well. It's great to be here back in Addis Ababa. So, you know, taking a step back, when we took a step back and realized that the true positive social impact that's going to happen on our continent, particularly for SMMEs, young entrepreneurs, women entrepreneurs, is if everybody has a high quality and affordable smartphone. It will truly enable so much to take place on the continent, from real financial inclusion, so not just mobile money, but true digital banking, digital education, digital healthcare, agricultural efficiencies, truly enabling e-commerce, last mile logistics. So much can become possible. But the challenge we have as a continent is we do have high quality, but they're not affordable. And the ones that are affordable, let's not talk about the quality. And the second big issue has been that as a continent, we've been a real consumer of smartphones and phones in general, but we're not really creating employment around it. We're not adding any value to the value chain. And that's when we took a step back and said, you know, as Mara Phones, how do we crack these two codes? So we came up with a strategy to actually put up manufacturing plants on the continent. And when I say manufacturing, this is not assembling. I mean, there are some assembly plants in Africa that are putting 5, 6 pieces together. We're actually doing the real manufacturing, which means we're making the motherboards locally, we're making the subboards locally, we're putting, to produce 3,000 phones, we require 3 million components. So this is really high-tech, sophisticated manufacturing. And we made a commitment at the Africa Investment Forum in 2018 and the South African Investment Conference in 2018 to put up 2 factories, one in Rwanda and one in South Africa. And I'm very pleased to say that within 11 months, Mara phones delivered. And we now have 2 up and running manufacturing plants, one in Kigali and one in Durban. And this is truly proudly African. This is made in Africa. We've always had this thing of, and we've said this numerous times, and I think the minister touched on it as well, which is it's time we start promoting and supporting ourselves. If we're not adding value and creating value in the value chain, it defeats the purpose. So the way the US has Apple, the way China has Tecno and Huawei, the way Korea has Samsung, finally Africa has Mara phones. And just to kind of play on that narrative, and Minister, you touched on it, that for example, on the fashion side, we as a continent have some amazing designs happening. My fiancée Krishna and I, at the opening of the factory in Rwanda, were wearing an Imigongo design. She's actually wearing one now. And then at the time of the South African launch, we were wearing the Ndebele design, which I'm wearing now. It shows you we've got the ability to actually create some amazing stuff on our continent. It's time we proudly start using what is ours. And the amazing narrative shift is that, firstly, Africa is ready to produce its own, consume its own. We're also ready to support ourselves and write our own story, which is long overdue. But at the same time, we're able to do high-tech manufacturing as a continent. Our plants have electrical engineers and electricians, etc. We have over 450 employees between the 2 factories. Over 60%, Shada, over 60% of them are women, which is the highest gender ratio in any smartphone manufacturer globally. Excellent. Excellent. The highest gender ratio in a smartphone manufacturing plant is 28%, and we're 60% plus, which means our quality is obviously going to be better. And secondly, over 90% are youth, right? So it shows you that not only can we shift the narrative, but we can actually break boundaries which have not been broken globally. Why not?
Okay, so we're going to look at upscaling, okay? So this is an amazing story, Ashish, and I heard you for the first time at one of Arancha's World Export Development Forums in Kigali, and I was like, wow, this is really the story to be told. And since then, it's going from better to better, if you like. What are the sort of challenges you face, or what are your ideas about? Now you've got 2, Rwanda and Uganda. South Africa, that's right. Your company originally started off in Uganda, which is why it's in my mind. What happens next?
It's a great question. I mean, we announced last week at the Africa Investment Forum that we're putting up a 3rd factory now in Nigeria. But I think the bigger picture is obviously taking advantage. You see, the one big encouragement factor has been, I witnessed the signing of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement in Kigali. I was there at the time. And I think this is a very, very key element for us as well. Because when you think about, the number of little trade agreements we've had from the East African community to the ECOWAS, to SADC, and to COMESA, and to this, and to that, and then some things are overlapping. The Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement really makes you realize that there's huge potential and scale available on the continent now. We're dealing, I think the Minister of Ethiopia mentioned this earlier as well, that now we're working with a much, much larger market in that respect. So I think that changes the ballgame for us. But also what's been very interesting, and this is what we were discussing with Ranier as well, is that, we've got something called maraphones.com, where you can order a phone from anywhere in the world, and it's got a tie-up with DHL, so immediately it's delivered to you within a week or 2. And obviously, Africa is our largest consumers in terms of distributors and telecom companies and banks. But what's been phenomenal is over the last 1 month, we have exported to over 43 countries. And the largest countries in terms of retail volume on maraphones.com, do you know what the top 5 countries are? Number 1 is Germany. Number 2 is the United Kingdom. Number 3 is the United States. Number 4 is Italy. And number 5 is Switzerland. These are 5 countries which is our highest sale volumes of Mara phones made in Africa being exported to these countries on maraphones.com, which has been phenomenal. It's been very interesting. And it all of a sudden makes you realize that, you know what, Asia does not have exclusivity to export high-tech equipment to the rest of the world. We actually can do it, and we can actually do it better and more stylish. and cheaper and much more cost-effective.
Okay, and then Ashish was telling me this story about how you can have your name engraved on the phone, but I'm not going to. I'm going to have that done. Thank you very much, Ashish. So I think in the second round, I'm going to ask you about the challenges. So let's focus on the good story now, and then after that, let's look at what lies ahead in terms of actually getting rid of some of the obstructions or obstacles that lie ahead. So Hani Salam Sombol, welcome as well, Chief Executive Officer, International Islamic Trade Finance Corporation. You've been listening, nodding, agreeing, and sometimes saying, wow.
Of course.
So give us your opinion of what's happening
maybe
here.
I don't have my story is not as exciting as yours, but we have the money at least.
So make it exciting for us.
We make a good combination. So,
so make it exciting for us.
No, I will talk about really. When we came in the car with Ashish, I really asked, I was very impressed by his story, honestly, and the success story, and that's really an example of how sometimes the impossible can be possible, and nothing is impossible in Africa, and that's how I see young people around Africa today and the future generations who can replicate so many of these success stories that now Ashish is telling us. This is just a start, and I'm sure there are many other examples in Africa which I personally know through my career, almost like 3 decades in development banking. I've seen good stories, but now you can see now with the new technology, innovation, things are becoming really more exciting for Africa and possible, I would say. To talk really about the good story about the group is this, of course, I'm referring here to the Islamic Development Bank Group, which is, of course, largest institution, financial institutions in the OIC member countries. The organization of Islamic cooperation. This is, of course, maybe the only South cooperation or South organization that is really felt for Africa, not now because of the new agreement, but actually from the first day of inception, of first day of establishment of the group, we had Africa in the heart of all what we do. Of course, I represent the trade arm of IDB Group, which is, of course, the International Islamic Trade Finance Corporation. And, of course, we are also very proud that when we started our operations, we started with Africa. And now I feel very proud that all over the last years we have been achieving almost like $75 billion of really financing. And I would say very proudly that 2/3 of our member countries in Africa benefited from that. ITFC, of course, as I said, it's not just a financing organization. When we established ITFC, we wanted really to serve the mandate of the whole group when we established. Many of you think that financial institutions should really only think about dollars. But in fact, IDB Group was built on a very, very clear mandate, which is integration and solidarity, and exactly what the new agreement for Africa is really calling for. So integration and solidarity was actually our main mandate and focus. We've been able actually to serve Africa, as I said, since the beginning, in addition, of course, to the other 58 member countries. However, we started very proudly with big initiatives, like the Africa initiatives. When we started, the total amount of financing for Africa was less than $100 million per year. And I feel very proud today to say that we are achieving the $1 billion of financing for Africa on an annual basis. Many sectors in Africa were really benefited. Of course, I don't want to talk much about it, but I can say that we have been really contributing as much as we can with our partners to really serve Africa, major strategic sectors like the energy sectors, the agricultural sectors, and now, of course, with the SDGs, at least we are serving 11 out of the 17 SDGs, and we are really serving Africa through that. ITFC, as I said, is a trade solution. We don't want to be looked at only a financing organization. That's why in 2017 we started a new business model where we are really offering Africa integrated solutions, trade finance on one hand, and also bringing the capacity of upgrading Africa's capacities on the other hand. Financing alone will not do it. Financing alone will not do it for Africa. That's why we felt we have to have these kind of packages. And these packages, of course, we don't do it alone. We do it with partners like the Africa Exim Bank, like ITC, and like others who are really have the same focus on Africa. I was really very proud to see that we have also launched 2 years ago one of the most important integration programs, which is the Arab-Africa Trade Bridge. The Arab-Africa Trade Bridge is exactly what the mandate or the objective of this big agreement, the Continental Free Trade Agreement. In my view, this is, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, Arinsha, it is the largest agreement since the establishment of the WTO. And it is the most, maybe the scope of this agreement is the most comprehensive. We are trying now our best really to serve Africa in the future of Africa. By the way, I was talking to one of the very reputable ministers in Africa and I always brag saying Africa is the future. But he said, no, he corrected me and he said, Africa is the present.
Honey,
and that is really very important to really know where we are going. 3 things we are trying to do now.
Can I just ask you, sorry, I'm not going to interrupt you. I just want to say, because the minister has spoken about SMEs.
Yes.
And please do say what you wanted to say, but also just tell us a little bit more about the SMEs. Thanks.
Definitely. As I said, I just want to talk about how we are really customizing our trade solutions to the needs of Africa and to the needs of other member countries. You talked about coffee. We used to finance coffee, but we found that this financing alone was actually doing nothing to improving the yields of the land, doing nothing to bring really new ways of really cultivation, of farming. So we said we need to really offer packages to the farmers where they can build their capacities and they can be enrolled in training and can be enrolled actually into new ways of using the technology. And in addition to that, we provide financing. Definitely the impact was much better. We do that with groundnuts in Africa. We do that actually with the cotton. I don't want to say we are the cotton bank of Africa, but I always say that this is really our aim. We are really financing a lot of this very important white gold for Africa in Burkina Faso, in Cote d'Ivoire, and others. Talking about the SMEs, you cannot really, I don't want to talk now about the challenges because maybe we'll have the second round, but definitely building the SMEs by all means constitute 80 to 85 to 90 sometimes % of the economic tissues of member countries. You cannot improve, you cannot diversify, you cannot have growth without really supporting this important sector. In the past, many of the programs, some countries were successful, but here in Africa we felt that we need really to focus on that. 2 years ago we launched the ITFC SME Development Program. And what is this program? Also a program to help the SMEs be able to access financing through really upgrading their capacities and also training them, making them prepare good bankable documents for the banks and talk to the banks. On the other side, the training and capacity building not only for the SMEs. In the same package, we offer line of financing to African banks, and in the same time, we train the African banks to be able to speak to SMEs. We started this in Burkina Faso. The percentage of as many of you may read in many articles, of declined request for financing was almost 100%. But now, with these programs, the SMEs were able actually to improve this percentage. This year, we replicated the same in Senegal. And we are also having a long list of requests to really implement this very important SME. The other SMEs is actually the Launchpad. We also kicked off the big program 2 years ago in West Africa.
Thank you.
So I see 1 minute there, so
yeah.
you can raise
where
that.
Where do you see it?
I
don't
see it, so
thing.
you have to raise it higher. So yes.
Yeah, exactly.
So I have 1 minute.
You have 1 minute to wrap up.
As I said, we are for Africa, and as I said, we have a lot of solutions for Africa, and I'm sure that if I was giving the chance, I can give you many successful stories to show how really the ITFC was a very, very active in Africa, not now, but since establishment of the group. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hani. So you said nothing is impossible.
No, nothing is impossible.
Nothing is impossible, but obviously you need money to make it possible. So thank you very much indeed. In fact, the minister didn't really know about what you were doing, so this is a good moment to connect on that and learn a little bit about what the ITFC is doing and what your plans are as well. Okay, let's turn to Ranieri Sabatucci. Great to see you here in Addis. Used to meet very often when we were in Brussels, when you were in Brussels. I'm still there. So Ranieri, from the European Union's point of view, so the EU is obviously a very successful organization, despite what you've said, Minister, about Brexit, a very successful union, political, economic, and social as well. And when you see this initiative in Africa, it's been there for some time, but now really taking form, moving forward, how does it make you feel? And where do you see synergies, inspiration, connections, advice, counseling, learning for the EU and the AU?
Thank you very much, Shada. And it's true, we have been very much engaged and enthusiastic supporter of the CFTA since the very, very beginning. And I like now to just note that the acronym remained the same, CFTA, but the last letter change used to be agreement and now is area. And this tells you already where we are going, right? And I think is that the reason why we've been extremely supportive of this enterprise is first because we see it as the game changer for the continent. African development will happen through an integrated continent and can only happen through an integrated continent. And this is our interest as Europeans to see happening. The second is because integration is our DNA, is in the European Union DNA. And we share this DNA with the African Union. And in a world where, as Arantxa said, is challenging multilateralism, and if I could quote our new High Representative, Mr. Borrell, he said, you cannot be multilateralist alone. You need to find other partners with whom you want to fight this battle to strengthen multilateralism. So with this context, just to say the three things that came to our mind, because of course sharing experience in how to make a market is one of the things we can do to best contribute. We have been there before, we are still going through it, because one of the lessons is that actually you never achieve a customs union or common market or a single market is a process that never finishes because the world changes and therefore you need to adapt. And so the first, if you like, finding we have is that it takes a long time. And I'm not saying this to justify or to look for excuses, but is a major, major event that touches the life of everyone. In the EU, to declare the single market, it took us basically 36 years.
I'm on it.
And, you know, the fact, this is until we declared the single market in '94. But as I said before, we are still, 60 years after, we are still battling with some of the impediment of the things that do not allow us to really call saying that we have a truly perfectly functioning single market. We still need to make progress on fiscality. We still need to make progress in public procurement. Standards need to be modernized every time because things change. And at the same time, these standards, especially in the area of social and environmental standards. The second thing we learned is that you need to learn to adapt. You need a lot of adaptability. You can plan as much as you like, but reality changes. I'll give you another example. The first time that the willingness to establish a customs union was done in Europe was at the Treaty of Rome in 1958. And the plan was to remove tariffs. And we said we will do this in 10 years. It's a little bit like the CFTA is saying. We need 10 years to remove the tariffs. And what happened in 1968, we met the target. The tariffs were lowered. But then something else happened. And Shada, you mentioned before the member states. What happened, the member states introduced non-tariff barriers. And nobody knew that that was going to happen, right? They did this to reestablish a level of protection for their market. And so this was something which was unforeseen, but even worse, there was no timetable to remove them. And for those who understand trade, non-tariff barriers are even worse, can be even worse than tariff barriers. And this is one of the challenges the Africa has, is that it needs to make sure that this happens in conformity consistently with the objective of CFTA. The third thing is that you need to be flexible and progressive. Today, the single market is 28 member states who benefit from the full single market. One of these member states wants to leave. 7 wants to join. We have countries which enjoy a large part of the single market, which are not in the European Union, such as Norway, Switzerland, Iceland, Liechtenstein. We have other countries that benefit to a great extent of the single market, which are not in this group, like Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia. So what I'm saying is that you have to have something to fit, to allow everybody to fit in a different way. So these, I would say, are the 3 major lessons we got over the years.
Thank you very much, Rani. So, as you said, flexibility, adaptability, twists and turns in our journey at the European Union. Given our European strengths and weaknesses, what are the areas where you think that the EU and the AU can actually effectively work together?
Well, I think the first one I just mentioned, sharing the experience. Sharing the experience, it means also sharing the challenges. What was problematic? And this is what we are very committed to do. The second, of course, is also to provide a support and continue to share experience, because we call it technical and financial support in the broad sense of the CFTA. The CFTA is not only about trade. It's not only about trade regulation and tariffs. CFTA is also about connectivity, infrastructure. You need to be able to move things from one country to the other. And therefore, you need also the harmonization. It's also about free movement of people. And this is crucial. And since a number of years already, since many years, we have tried to share our experience about movement of people. How do you recognize skills and qualification from each other country? In Europe is one of the fundamental freedom. I can go with my university degree as a doctor, and I can work in another country as a doctor, as an entrepreneur, as an engineer. This took years and is a very, very sensitive task. So over a number of years, we've been working to try to establish a common qualification and to facilitate portability. And then the last, and of course, in facilitating also the movement of a staff and research institution. Today, 130 universities in Africa interacting, and we support the transfer of staff and students within African countries, a little bit like the Erasmus program did in Europe, which was the most successful and most popular program we ever had in Europe. The last, of course, is to support investment. Everybody says, we are all supporting investment. The way we try to do it is to use it to basically crowd in private sector investment by using, because development money will not do this, will not fix, will not really change this. What development money can do, though, is to be a lubricant to bring in investment. So through guarantees, through blending, and the idea, and we already achieved more or less the target, was to use 4.5 billion euros to crowd in 10 times as much of private sector, and this is the intention to achieve until 2020, and possibly to establish a new opportunity, a new instrument in the future. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that first round. Obviously, we're seeing great things happening. We have big projects, and we are all energized by it. And indeed, I have to say, in a world where multilateralism is under threat, the fact that these countries Africa is coming together, that is a good signal to send to others who do not believe in coming together, who like divisions more than people coming together. So thank you very much for that. Let's, in this second round, before I turn to our participants here, let's look at some of the challenges we face and how constructively we can overcome them. So starting with you, Minister, from your point of view, small businesses, SMEs, as I said earlier, you know, it often is that we're looking at big investors, we're looking at big companies. From your point of view, what do you see are, say, 3 or 4 main challenges that you would like to surmount in the coming, in building this One Africa?
Thank you. Maybe let me start by saying I think the EU will be much stronger without Britain as a market, and that's why we believe that the African continental trade area will be much stronger with the support of the EU, and there are many lessons to learn from you.
Thanks.
The first thing I think, which...
Turn off your microphone.
Oh, sorry.
The first thing that I think would be a major challenge is to build patriotism. And you say, why do you talk about patriotism in a multilateral arrangement? It's because a market is viable because of its buyers, and its buyers are people. And earlier I've spoken about the need to say, if Kenya and Ethiopia are strong on coffee, we'll get Kenya and Ethiopia to bring coffee to South Africa because we don't have coffee, and then we get Rooibos to come up as a better team. And you say, as South Africans, you must learn to buy local, because we've got buy local campaign. If they start to buy Rooibos on Rooibos, and you say, where you don't have, because the coffee that comes in is Kenyan or Ethiopian, you say, let's buy coffee from Africa, because you say, buy local, buy Africa. That's the first part. So you need that patriotism, because even you will not have an integrated economy when the development of our countries are still not at the same path. So states must develop their own countries to move at the same level. And you can't achieve that by harmonization. You must achieve that by developing, then you can harmonize, because you then become on an equivalent platform. And related to that is the issue of the payment system. For trade to happen, you need to pay. Yes, we have moved in Africa in terms of mobile money platforms, but mobile money platforms they are good for interstate payment. But when you do intra-state, it doesn't work. You need a real digital payment system. But the central banks would say, we cannot open our central bank, and I know the central bank in South Africa will say, we won't allow this to happen because it will weaken our currency. Yeah. And we have to protect the currency because we protect and strengthen the economy. So on our part, that will be another major issue for us to sort out. If we don't sort out the payment system or the strengthening of the financial systems in Africa, trade will not happen. For instance, I have young people, SMMEs, who are doing skincare range, but they source their material from Ghana and Mozambique. It's easier for them to source from Mozambique and get payments because we already have a payment system through the SACU plus M. But when it's Ghana, they have to plan 60 days ahead for their inventory to come in, which does not work in any business. They're not productive, they're not efficient. And we're looking at saying, how do we partner with the government of Ghana to improve that payment? Because they are really stocking a lot of material. Because the economy now is digital, so it no longer needs physical presence. So we should be able to produce goods in Uganda and sell them in South Africa without having a presence in South Africa, because online trading will allow us that, but there should be a payment system that goes there. So for me, it's one of those things that we must sort out. So we must sort out is the development, patriotism, and the payment systems.
So when you talk about patriotism, you're actually talking about buy African. Sorry, I'm just talking. When you say patriotism, you're actually talking about buy African, not buy South African.
By both. You can't start at Africa without talking about your own. Okay. Because if we talk about South African, it means I'll make a commitment to go and build a stronger South Africa for a stronger Africa. Okay. So it's South African and African.
Okay, thanks. Thank you very much. So Ashish, from your point of view, given your sort of trans-continental reach, what do you see as 2 or 3 top challenges?
Thank you, Shana. I mean, do you know I'll give you a real example of what we went through as Mara Phones. I mean, some of the challenges are natural, where, you know, we were advised by a lot of people saying manufacturing is not really done on the continent in the true sense. So why don't you actually start by importing, creating a bit of volume, then start assembling, and then create a bit more volume, then do manufacturing, which makes sense logically. And then we've had a few strong friends and supporters, Arantxa being one of them, who have always kind of encouraged to say, you know, you must go all out if we're going to make it happen in the true sense. If you're not truly made in Africa, then you can't claim to be, we will be made in Africa once we get these volumes. That story doesn't work. So you've got to put your money where your mouth is. I mean, each one of these factories is a $100 million investment for us. It's very large for our group. So, you know, it's actually truly believing in the fact that, and I've said this before many times, that as a continent, we're not a short-term investment destination. If you're looking at medium to long-term investment destination, there's no better place than our continent, right? The second large challenge was also on the side of DFIs and multilaterals, where, you know, the traditional style has been, you know, we need to see this and we need to see that and all of that. Now, to be honest, so that was a challenge, because obviously you're looking at large pools of capital, which without capital, these projects don't come to life, right? Now we're seeing the fact that we've delivered 2 factories, we've got a third one in the pipeline. Now that you know, there's a lot more interest and excitement to be working with us. And we were able to, with God's grace, pull it off and make sure we delivered these 2 factories in the full-fledged sense. But this is important when we're looking at the broader continent and a lot of ideas and concepts that our young entrepreneurs and women entrepreneurs have. The capital to back them is very, very critical. And I think the third element, I mean, it's a huge advantage, which is the fact that we've got the Africa Continental Free Trade Area now. But what's important is our countries must, and as a bloc now, we must support and promote local manufacturing. And our countries must clearly understand the difference also between manufacturing and clipping 3 things together, right? Clipping little 3 things together, which is, you know, not even real assembly. It's like, you know, I don't know what to call it, should not be classified in the same manner as manufacturing. So it's really important that our countries do support, promote, and protect real long-term investments which are manufacturing, right? And I think that's another very, very critical piece that needs to come together.
And that's a change of mindsets and policies at a national level in Africa that is required as well, to move from assembling to manufacturing and actually making that a priority.
Absolutely. And I mean, look, it's nobody's fault, but when nothing is, we're a pure consumer as a continent, and somebody comes and says, look, I'm going to make it in your country, and all they're actually doing is putting this together and telling you that they're making it, when you're not really creating any value, you're not creating high-skilled jobs, you're not doing anything of that nature, defeats the purpose, right? Making a motherboard requires robotics, requires like a real sensitive area and all of that, and that's what we've put on the ground on the continent.
Okay. Hani Sombol, from your point of view, please.
Of course, we have to be very realistic that this kind of a major project, that to have really this one Africa is not going to happen tomorrow. We need really to have this long vision and look how much we can do for our next generations in Africa to benefit actually from what we are going to do today. Why? Because there's a lot to be done. I'm not going to focus here today on the issues, the normal issues, but there are many, I can list of them, but there are important ones which is related to a financial institution like ITFC, is that I think we have seen many needs to be done. When we started really exploring and seeing what can we do in addition to what we are already doing for Africa, and we started our dialogue with some stakeholders, we felt maybe we can go first into raising the awareness of the impact of this agreement on the future of Africa and advocacy. Number 2 is that we as a group, which we have very diversified solutions, we can also tackle many challenges for countries who do not have the basic things, which is the national strategies. We need to help African really to build their national strategies that is linked to this kind of an agreement. Hopefully a dream will come also true one day when we are going to have a business index that will also be able for us to monitor and do a good assessment of what we are doing. Number two is that also from a point of view of an institution like ITFC, partnership is very important. We cannot do it alone. The gaps are big in many areas, and the requirements for this integration really includes all important sectors that you can think of: the infrastructure, technology, diversification, the agriculture, agribusiness, many. And many partners now already, as I have been hearing, already started thinking of going into this kind of direction. Partnership is okay, but without really a real coordination. In the past, we have seen many partners work together. Okay, each one will go in a different direction. And we need really to have this kind of a platform where we are together to see what each one of us is doing and try either to complement or try to add to that. Reforms should continue. I think now many countries, we have seen really Africa already started these reforms. And the big example is actually the high growth that been recorded for the last 5 or 6 years, sustainable, 7%, 8%. Look at Ethiopia. I know Ethiopia since I was 2 years old, by the way. And when I see it today, okay, I am really very impressed by the way really these reforms are really bringing fruits to the country. Look at Kigali, look at others in West Africa. And so we should really continue to do the reforms. The last thing is that MDBs, partners, others cannot do something that the governments do not want to do. So the political will to really go and ripe the fruits of these agreements in the coming future is the political will of each country. And today we see that it is happening by signing and ratifying this agreement. That shows really an extremely positive side. ITFC, as I said, we are now already started our dialogue. Tomorrow I'm going, actually tonight, going to Cairo. We are going to have also a session on the impact of this financing agreement on Africa as a part of our really efforts to see how can we really build a good program for Africa in the coming few years.
Thank you very much. Thank you for insisting also on the coordination between all the different organizations, banks, institutions working, and the need for continuing reform. So Ranieri, my question to you is, you talked about the private sector, and you talked about how important it is to attract foreign direct investment into the CFTA. From your perch, from your vantage point of view, what are the European investors, potential businesses, investors, etc., saying to you about the CFTA?
I mean, we hear, there is not one European private sector that has a unique view. So obviously we talked to a number of people. Some are enthusiastic, some are skeptical, some they think it will take too long, some say maybe will not even take it too long. But I mean, the point here is the fact that the argument we make is, number one, Africa is growing and will continue to grow. So if you want to look at a region where you need to invest, is obviously where it grows, and Africa is the second fastest region in the world in terms of growth at the moment, and things can accelerate actually. So this is the first thing. The second is that obviously there are difficulties, and everybody uses this word, the business environment. We would like to work in a situation where there is a more enabling business environment. But, it depends also, you cannot, in fact, if the business environment was perfect, you would probably not have the kind of opportunities you have. So in a way, you have to trade off this, and and I think in a effective private sector, and it's one of the things the European private sector should ask himself, whether, they have the ability or the hunger to go after this kind of opportunity. One of the things that I'm reassured is that things will get constantly, progressively better, because the integration process, in a way, has an effect on the business environment. This is what we learned. governance in general, but in business, has improved dramatically as the integration process of Europe went forward. And this is because if you have situations where somebody enjoys more benefits than others, he will complain. He would not want to play in the same field where somebody is having more support, more subsidies than somebody who doesn't. You know, that makes it an uncompetitive market. So what happens is that there is, instead of having a race to the bottom, and this is the other thing, is to make sure there is a race towards the top. And I think normally integration, our experience is that the race is towards the top. And this is very important in terms of social aspects, you know, having labor standards agreed, having labor standards enforced, and you know, decent jobs provided is very important for environmental standards. There are situations, and let's face it, where, you know, around the world and in Africa as well, where there are kind of investment that is kind of predatory and leaves the place much worse off than when they started. And I think the integration process in itself needs to address this, and I think that this is very important for the European business to be able to ensure that there is a plain level field with clear social standards and environmental standards. This is where I think we could get the best out of European business. Thanks.
I'm just going to open the floor to questions, and you can.
I just want to add one thing I forgot.
Okay,
need to say
just
that.
go ahead quickly. Yeah.
There's one thing I also repeat all the time. I'm sorry to come back, Shada, but also we need to change the way we do business in Africa. Okay, enough with really exporting unprocessed commodities. You need, now we are living in this industrialization week. This is the main gate, actually, for Africa. If you continue to export or doing business the same by exporting these non-processed or unprocessed commodities, Africa will not gain. You need to upgrade your industries so that you can have this added value to your countries. Thank you.
Thank you for making that very valuable point. Okay, so I did promise you interaction, and I see some hands going up already. So I see one gentleman, two. I need women. Yes, I need more young women. Okay, so I've got about 5. So, gentlemen over there, please introduce yourself, and I have to make a plea. We only have about 25 minutes.
Yes,
so
please.
A short and snappy question, please.
Sure.
Thank you.
My name is Benunula. I'm an investment banker. I've been transaction advisor for Central Corridor in East and Central Africa. I welcome the gentleman there from the Arab Bank. The key thing is...
Sorry, there are 2 microphones open. The one who's speaking should keep it on. Yeah, please.
Am I being heard? Okay. The thing I'm worried about hearing all the panelists is we need to look at Africa in form of corridors. So if we do not plan and there's no game plan, there will be no coordination. We must take a holistic approach. In Africa, we have logistics problems. We have, special economic zones not integrated. But where is the master plan? With the new African Continental Free Trade Zone, if we come here next year and we have a master plan for Africa, we will reduce risk. We will be able to leverage on fintech to create patient capital. Africa hasn't got a shortage of opportunities, but we need a game plan so that we are all coordinating. Because if you are talking about industrialization...
You've asked your question, please. I need to turn to other people.
So the point here is, how can you support us to create a master plan of these corridors in Africa so that we all are plugging into the same game plan?
Thank you very much. Very important question. Let me go to the gentleman over there, please.
Good morning. My name is Mark Pearson. I'm not affiliated to any institutions. Thanks very much for the contribution from the panel. My question really is on Mara phones. I think that we would all agree that from the presentation, Mara phones is an African product. But if you look at the rules of origin that we have at the moment in COMESA, in SADC, etc., you find that for mobile phones in COMESA, you need at least 60% value addition, less than 60% value addition of imported products. and a 30% local value-added content. In SADC, there are no rules of origin for mobile phones, so you cannot get any preferences. So the question really is, are you in discussion at the Africa Union? Because if you're going to have the same rules of origin for the Africa Continental FTA, then you're not made in Africa at all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very, very, very good question on value-added rules of origin. Yes, the gentleman over there and then the lady over here. But first,
Thank you very much, panel, for your beautiful discussions. My name is Paul O'Mara, and I'm a private sector player from Uganda. There are 4 things that I see as a big hindrance to trade. And I just don't know how you people are going to handle it, and it should be a matter of debate. One is common currency. Africa has various currencies that when they want to convert it, they will either use dollars, pound sterling, or euros. So the conversion of these currencies is very expensive to Africa. Are we going to have a common currency? Second is travel. If you have to travel from Entebbe to Lilongwe in Malawi, you have to fly to Addis Ababa, then to Zambia, then you connect to Malawi. What are we going to do around transport by building synergies with very many African airlines? The other one is immigration. Why don't we allow people to fly in and out? We get our visas at the airports instead of these, applying for visas to fly within African countries. And then the last one is actually tax policies. Are we going to have common tariff agreements for the African countries? I thank you.
Thank you very much for those questions. Lady over here, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Santa from Uganda. He read my mind. I'm not going to repeat myself. But my question is to Ambassador of European Union. Africa, particularly, I'm talking about myself and Uganda. Exporting to Europe is like going to heaven, simply because our certification is normally not honored. So I don't know what we are going to do. Secondly, how much do Africa export to Europe, and how much does Europe import from Africa? The other gentleman over there also read my mind. You prefer raw materials from Africa, and my question is, why? Lastly, I trust in trade, partnership is key, because it's a win-win. And that writing, well export, I think it should have been, there should be some word at the beginning. And trade and invest in Africa, I think the word should be let us trade and invest in Africa. Literally, if you look at that, it seems Africa is inviting somebody. But unless you go further, then you'll understand what it means. Well, export, let us have interstate trade and then export to other world later on. I thank you.
Thank you very much, madam, for those questions. And sir, over here, please.
Hi, my name is Prince David Iwita. I am the National Vice President of the Nigerian Chamber of Commerce. Now, my own contribution is in discussing small and medium scale under a platform of industrialization of Africa. I think it's a mismatch because small and medium scale cannot industrialize Africa. If we are talking of large scale paired with medium scale, and those two units coming together can attract capital, and small scale will fuse into it. Otherwise, there is no avenue for small scale to have assets. We will discuss it for several years. We can never get it because infrastructure, capital, and other impediments are major challenges against small-scale businesses to play in industrialization of any country that I've ever seen. Countries that have, prospered in their small-scale businesses have all of these challenges that we are discussing in Africa today already solved. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to stop with the questions here, but thank you very much indeed for all your interventions. I'm going to turn back to the panel, and we have 15 minutes before we have to end this, so I would ask you to be really short and to the point. Don't feel obliged to answer each and every question, but do answer the ones relevant to you. So Ashish, I'm going to kick off with you, please.
Sure. No, I think it's a great question on rules of origin. We are obviously adding a lot of value to the process already by actually making the motherboard, by making the subboard. But one thing we have an ambition and a vision to do is over the next 10 years, the minister touched on this earlier as well, where we want to do a lot of backward integration using small and medium enterprises to actually, things like chargers, for example, should not be imported. We can actually manufacture these kind of things locally. The challenge is obviously that semiconductors, and a lot of semiconductors such as Qualcomm and MediaTek, and our sound system is Dolby, our glass system is Corning glass. All of these are patented globally, right? So there's always going to be that element. However, some of these things are still, the origin of their raw material is also our continent. So over 10 years, our dream is to see that how do we even create partnerships to do more backward integration and to make that happen and do all of that. Coca-Cola makes beverages, but they don't grow their own sugar. So it doesn't mean that we need to make our own semiconductors necessarily, but we would love to play a role in actually helping enable that. The bottom line falls into place, which is the value add that's there already does qualify for a lot of these. To your point right now, is with so many different regional trade agreements, you know, there's different rules that apply. And I think the African Continental Free Trade Area and that particular agreement needs to take this into consideration, and we are in discussions with some of the relevant stakeholders in that respect.
Ashish, I do want your point of view on the questions that were raised by the gentleman over here about the lack of the common currency, the travel connectivity issue, migration and tax problems. I mean, as a businessman, how are you coping with this imbroglio?
No, I think it's a fantastic point. I think the minister touched on it as well, and you see, common currency I think would be great. I think what's more important is even our central banks being able to talk to each other more freely. So more a free movement of currencies taking place. And I've heard about a lot of initiatives such as the AfriExim has actually created something called the PAP solution, and there's many others which are kind of coming up with it. It is an important element. I think tax standardization and making sure that's there is obviously a clear one. The one thing that keeps on frustrating me, which is the immigration one, I mean, you know, it's easier for foreigners to travel around our continent than it is as fellow Africans. It doesn't make sense at all. I think Ranieri was saying last night that, I mean, the trade within the continent needs to be boosted first before we even think about trading outside the continent. And that can only happen if there's free movement of people as well, because goods and services are integrated. I mean, Mara phones it's fantastic. It's an African phone. It's made in Africa, but it's not just a piece of hardware. We look at ourselves as an ecosystem provider. So we need to think about how our services that we're encompassing can actually go freely across the continent too, be it payment solutions, be it credit scoring solutions, be it, you know, phone locking technology solutions. But all of our value additive ecosystem solutions need to also move freely. So the free movement of people is absolutely a very critical one. So there's a very good points raised, and it still is a little frustrating. I think even coming to Addis Ababa to go to Lilongwe, we're within our continent. Sometimes traveling within West Africa, you have to go to Europe to come back to our continent, which is even more frustrating, right? It's just, it does need to change, it does need to move, and I think a lot more collaboration is required.
Ranieri, I was going to give you the floor, but the lady who asked the question isn't sitting in her place anymore.
But you haven't answered two questions.
No, it's fine. We need to move. So I'll wait for her to come back, maybe. So I'll go to you. Hani Sambol, yes.
First of all, before I answer two questions here, I think my dear panelist here, Mr. Ashish, is referring to the question mentioned related to the origin, is actually one of the solutions is the global value chain. We need to really, when I said we need to change the way we do business, is that we need to get Africa involved in the global value chain graph. If you look at the graph today, all the global value chain is actually concentrated on certain countries. Once you have Africa involved, this will be a really great advantage for Africa. Number two is that there's, of course, I don't represent Arab Bank. I represent the Islamic Development Bank, and I'm also representing the International Islamic Trade Finance Corporation. This is just for the name. What I was really calling for, I fully agree with you. This is exactly what I called for, more coordination, so that we can at least harmonize or at least partner up in building our programs together, or at least complementing each other so Africa can benefit. Today, as I said, one of the areas is to help member countries either do their diagnosis or the required, what they need to be able to benefit from the agreement and be involved in the agreement, or also we can help them in preparing their national strategies. That is what I meant. The group has really the ability to do that. So, and most of the other really issues raised here today is actually the issues that Africa is facing today. That's why there is an agreement now coming up to really say that if we do this, all these challenges will be much better in the future. Talking about infrastructure, transportation, talking about technology, all these matters, that's what is really the whole idea is all about, is to have this Africa hopefully not in a very long time, at least improve on these areas. And that's what I really wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hanisimbol. So, Ranieri, please.
Thanks. I mean, the question was why we prefer raw materials, and and there was a bit of not a very optimistic outlook question. Well, I think first of all, Maraphones already proves the contrary. Their first market, he said, 4 out of the 5 countries are in the single market. And this is partly a problem, as a matter of fact, is that Europe gives 0 import tariff to basically all African countries. So there is no import levy or restriction there. The problem is within Africa there are restrictions. So he was telling me yesterday that when he wants to export his phones to DRC, there is a 40% levy. Now, you understand that paradoxically, if we wanted to help Africa, probably we should raise the import levy rather than give it as it is now, which we would not do. It's just a thinking about it, to make you think about it. And here the story is that the great thing about the CFTA and why we think it is the way to go is because we learned this on our history. It creates your market. And the more robust, the more resilient is your market, the better you're able to call in investment and develop value chains. Today we talked a lot about trade, but we did not talk about investment in value chains enough. And value chains means being able to use and to, the skills and the competitiveness in each and every country in Africa in order to be more competitive globally. And this can only be done through an integrated process. And so I think this is the challenge that is facing Africa today, is this ability to lower the tariff. But bear in mind, this is not enough. Because as I said before, if you lower the tariff, but then you make it difficult through bureaucracy and formality, it's not going to happen, because people would still find it easier to move somewhere else where there are less formalities. So it's very important, I think, at this stage, really to not to look at us as the market, but to look at yourself as the market in the first place, before really thinking about, whether there is how will the world receive African products, and whether there is the ability to scale up from this perspective.
Minister, please.
Thank you. I think Ranier earlier spoke about why even the single market on its own is continuously improving. And for me, the CFTA will have to improve the other corridors, and SADC in particular. Yeah. So the discussion at the CFTA level of the rules of origin is forcing SADC to discuss the rules of origin for SADC, which will deal with some of the issues of the trade barriers within the SADC community. And that's why I was saying the growth must be organic, because we must improve on the corridors. And the issue of the common currency, I don't see us achieving a common currency in the next 20 years here. But what may be important is to achieve a trading platform and agreement of saying what do we convert as a standard. And that's why I mentioned that as South Africa, we're saying how do we strengthen from the SMME perspective our transactions or trade between SMMEs within the SACU plus M, COMESA and SADC, because that will bring a lot of commonalities because we're already remitting across the countries. That's there. And the interconnectedness of people in terms of travel, it is important to do that. Because when you fly to, there was a time, and it's an improvement where we are, there was a time when you had to fly to a country in Africa from South Africa, you had to fly to Europe and come back, especially to West Africa. You had to fly to Europe and then you fly to France and then come back, and it didn't make sense. But now when you're improving the interconnectedness, you need to talk about this visa-free arrangement, not even at a union level, but between states themselves, and the reciprocity of that. But you should remember that there's also the security challenge within Africa. That's why for us, as we assume the chairpersonship of the AU, the theme is silencing the guns for economic development. Because if we don't silence the guns, the free movement of goods will not take place. But lastly, I don't agree that SMMEs cannot industrialize. Because there are sectors, if we focus, we can decide that this is going to be driven by SMMEs and we industrialize. What is important is what he said earlier about developing a business index of where we need to find ourselves, because the SMMEs, from micro, we must work that they become small, from small they must be medium, from medium they must be large. And that's where they will drive, because they will drive in that area. If we say we're going to mostly in the micro, you can say, well, let's move them to small, which becomes formal, and build that industry. And somebody talked about protecting certain industry for the growth of the countries and the continent at large, and that way we'll industrialize. But also the issues that we don't, in Africa, our definition of SMMEs is not the same, and maybe we must go back there and start to define it similarly. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all the panelists and also to interventions from yourself. So we're coming to the end of this, I think, rather fascinating conversation. I'm not going to try and wrap up and summarize what's been actually a very stimulating discussion, but I think what we're seeing here now, and as a think tanker who's been working on Africa for many, many years, first as a journalist as well, I think it is, and that's what we've seen elsewhere as well, it is great. It is important to have the big vision, the big picture, the long-term goals, and to work towards them through short-term and medium-term actions. So there's a balance between the big and the smaller picture. And I think that is what the CFTA is providing Africa, a kind of stimulus. I think it's very important for all of us to realize how much it has changed the narrative on Africa. And it is a very, very important story to tell. And in this world of Twitter feeds and snappy short statements, the narrative, the story really matters. And I think this is a very important story that has to be told, I have to say, in a bolder fashion across the world. So thank you very much for intervening. I think clearly for us, in this panel, we agree that African firms are the key to the economic transformation. It has to be done by African, whether they're small and medium-sized enterprise, or whether they're like yours, or whether they're bigger. Intra-African trade has to be the key, and I think you said that very clearly, Ranieri. It's not just what you export to the rest of the world, it's how much you can break down the barriers within Africa so that your inter-African trade. I think the figure at the moment is 18% or so. In Asia, it's 60%. In Europe, it's almost 80%. And I think those are the goals we have to work towards. And governments, obviously, business can do just so much. Business needs an enabling environment, a climate investment-friendly, manufacturing-friendly environment, and that behoves governments in all countries in Africa, as it is the case elsewhere, to provide the regulation, the regulatory framework that actually helps to unleash this energy and the innovation and creativity that Minister has talked about. Questions about connectivity, I think, are extremely important. Hard connectivity, but also soft connectivity. Students, tourists, business people, academics, being able to meet and talk to each other frankly, as we're doing here. Global supply chains is something that was mentioned as well, and I think that's very, very important as we go forward. Finally, I'd like to say that for me, who's been working on EU-Africa story for a very long time, this is a very, very defining moment. In the European Union, we have decided, there's consensus that Africa has to move up and has moved up higher on our list of priorities. Foreign policy, security policy, trade policy, assistance, development, coordination, equality in dealing with each other's. So Arantxa, you're here now. Let me just say thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to come and moderate what has been, for me, a very educative debate. Thank you very much indeed. Please join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shada, and thank you very much also to the distinguished panelists for their contribution to our first plenary session on investing in one Africa.